Dr. Earl J. Hess, who holds the Stuart McClellan Chair of History at Lincoln Memorial University, where he's taught since 1989. He completed his undergraduate studies at Southeast Missouri State University, and his PhD he received in American Studies with a concentration in history from Purdue University in 1986. Dr. Hess has taught at a number of institutions, including LMU, but the University of Georgia, Texas Tech, and the University of Arkansas. He is the author of numerous books on Civil War military history, and his book on Pickett's Charge was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize in 2002. The title of Dr. Hess's presentation today is Arguing Over the Civil War Death Toll. Does it really matter? He takes his charge and his question for this from J. David Hacker's 2011 article in the Civil War History, in which the author, using a statistical analysis, argues that the Civil War death toll should be dramatically increased. Others have doubted the accuracy of Hacker's figures, and Dr. Hess will, I'm sure, clear up all of those misunderstandings. One thing I have always noticed about Dr. Hess is that there is little doubt in his conclusions, and so I expect that we will have a similar response to these questions. Please welcome Dr. Hess.
Further confusion.
Thank you, Charlie, very much for that nice introduction, and welcome to everybody. It's a delight to see all of you here. My talk is very different than Mike's and George's. I like that because I don't feel like I have to rise up to their standards. And it's because Carol Campbell, several months ago, in asking me to do this talk, told me that she wanted me to deal with the meaning of the loss of the Civil War. And I thought to myself, okay, I've never really thought much about that. But because I always do what Carol tells me to do, I went ahead and said yes. And I'm delighted that she suggested this. It's an interesting topic, more interesting than I thought it would be, honestly. And I was fortunate, as Charlie mentioned, in the appearance in 2011 of an article that got a lot of attention in Civil War studies by J. David Hacker, a social historian, a census-based count of Civil War dead, published in CWH in 2011. He discounts the old assertion that 620,000 Union and Confederate soldiers died in the Civil War. Believes that figure was based on inadequate data. After doing research with what he calls new public use microdata samples of the 1850, 1860, 1870, and 1880 censuses, Hacker asserts that the figure is about 750,000 dead instead, Union and Confederate combined. Hacker clearly expressed his conclusion at the start and at the end of his article. The rest of the article, 28 pages, is filled with a detailed discussion of how he came about that conclusion. And frankly, it's a discussion that made my head hurt as I vainly tried to understand the statistical analysis involved. But I always, when coming across something like this, pay attention to the beginning and the end of these papers and not the middle part of it. So I can preserve my sanity. In the end, Hacker wisely, I think, backs off from his findings a little bit, in that he admits that no number crunching can be relied on 100% when dealing with fuzzy and incomplete data like we do with the Civil War. Despite its many shortcomings and wide range of possible error, says Hacker, a census-based count of Civil War death is preferable to the existing century-old estimate of 620,000 deaths. The human cost of the Civil War was greater than historians have long believed, he concludes, In fact, at least 20% greater if hackers' conclusions are reliable. Reaction to hackers' findings? Enthusiastic, indicating people are not only ready for something new about the Civil War, but eager to increase the level of human tragedy in their favorite American conflict, I think. And to me, that is the most interesting thing coming out of hackers' conclusions. Not so much the sophisticated stats analysis he did, but to me, how we react to what he concludes. The very eminent and well-known historian James McPherson strongly supported Hacker's article, asserting that he had always thought Confederate losses, at least, were undercounted by historians. James McPherson went on to point out that the number of civilian deaths due to Civil War action has always been a murky issue, with no real data to base an estimate on. But that has not prevented James McPherson from estimating, nevertheless, that 50,000 civilians died in the Civil War, in addition to 750,000 soldiers. He doesn't explain how he came to that conclusion, but he has stated that in print. And McPherson also points out that if one accepted Hacker's figure of 750,000 dead, a similar rate of loss today in modern America would kill 7.5 million Americans, based on a tenfold increase in the American population from 1860 to 2010. That's an interesting point to make. Now, Hacker's article was reported in the New York Times, the BBC News, the Wall Street Journal, the NBC Nightly News, and by national public radios, all things considered. Anytime a Civil War historian can make a record like that, you're doing something that people are interested in. But only 3 years later, after the appearance of Hacker's article, the counter-arguments began. Nicholas Marshall, in an article entitled The Great Exaggeration, Death in the Civil War, published in the other major journal for Civil War historians, the Journal of the Civil War Era in 2014. Interestingly enough, Marshall does not argue with Hacker's conclusions. He basically believes that Hacker is probably right, that the 750,000 figure is probably more accurate than the 620,000 figure, but Marshall is highly critical of historians who use death numbers to overemphasize the destructive nature of the Civil War and the enormity of the human toll it exacted on American history. Marshall accuses historians of committing the sin of presentism, that is, interpreting the past through the lens of modern culture rather than through the lens of contemporary culture of the 1860s. He argues persuasively we need to understand what the culture of the 1860s thought of the Civil War death toll, not what our modern society would think of it if a similar level of death took place today. And Marshall argues that the Civil War generation would probably not have been as impressed by this scale of loss as we tend to be impressed by it today. Death was a more common fact in pre-Civil War life in America. He points out that the civilian death rate in America in 1860, before the Civil War broke out, was roughly 2 or 3% of the entire population in any given year. And Marshall points out that this means that anywhere from 630,000 to 943,000 civilians died every year in pre-Civil War America. And that's an interesting way of looking at it because that's very close to this Civil War soldier death estimate that we're talking about. Marshall looks at it this way. During the Civil War years, from 1861 to 65, about 155,000 to 187,000 soldiers perished every year of the conflict, North and South combined. And that depends on what total figure of death you accept. If you believe 620,000 soldiers died in the whole Civil War, then that's about 155,000 per year. If you believe 750,000 soldiers died in the Civil War, that breaks down to about 187,000 per year. And Marshall makes another telling point. You probably are aware of this. Only 1 out of every 3 soldiers who died in the Civil War perished as a result of combat causes. The other 2/3 perished because of disease-related issues and health-related issues. Now, obviously, it doesn't matter which way you die, you're a war casualty on one level. But there's another important level here. If you want to argue how deadly and tragic military operations were in the Civil War, then you have to get away from 620,000 and have to understand that only 1/3 of those were the result of combat-related causes. If one only looks at the combat deaths, and you need to do so if you want to measure how destructive Civil War battle could be, then you have to assume that from 207,000 to 250,000 or so Americans died of combat-related causes during the 4 years of the Civil War combined. If you break that down into yearly losses, 51,000 to 62,000 Union and CS soldiers died from combat every year of the Civil War. Now those figures, I think, set the Civil War dead within an important context. They are not significantly higher than the normal civilian death rate of the era. In short, the Civil War death toll was not an unusual phenomenon within the context of American life in the mid-1800s. If you want to know what the current rate today, the death rate is about 0.08% per year, not 2 or 3%. So the death rate is far lower today than it was in 1860. But still, because we have about 300 million population in the US, that means that about 2.4 million Americans die every year out of that total population. There is little of any evidence in contemporary sources that Civil War contemporaries thought the losses in their war were catastrophic, or, as Marshall puts it, on a monumental or destabilizing scale beyond that of the antebellum period. And let me quote from a woman named Mary Christian Percy, who lived in a small town in upstate New York and commented in her diary on the effect of disease on the life expectancy of Civil War era civilians. She wrote in her diary, "Death stalks through cities and villages quite as mercilessly as upon the battlefield. Only it is here by slow disease that he wills them away, and there it is the bullet." So I think that's an indication that at least a lot of civilians tended to see their lives outside of the context of conflict and war to be a life of tragedy, and you can expect death, and you deal with it. And the level of loss, according to Marshall, is not proportionately so much greater than that it causes a different perception of what death means in your life. Let's switch tacks here a little bit. 5 years ago, the same J. David Hacker, along with 2 colleagues, published an interesting article about the effect of the Civil War on Southern marriage patterns, 2010. He and his colleagues concluded, quote, that a modest version of what demographers call a marriage squeeze affected Southern white women who reached marriage age during the Civil War. They, quote, postponed marriage or chose less appropriate husbands. But the results of this study demonstrate that women's feared spinsterhood growing out of the death rate of the Civil War failed to materialize over the long term. They argue that 92% of Southern white women eventually did get married by 1880. In other words, in essence, this article is supporting what Marshall is saying, that the Civil War death rate did not have a catastrophic effect on this particular interesting aspect of society. Now, I think hovering over all of this debate over the scale of death in the Civil War is an ongoing argument about the level of destructiveness created by our great American conflict from 1861 to 65. And in many ways, that argument started with the publication of Charles Royster's book, The Destructive War, William Tecumseh Sherman, Stonewall Jackson, and the Americans in 1991. There is a natural tendency of historians and students, I think, to emphasize the scale of destruction of human life and physical destruction in the Civil War in America's internecine conflict. That's a natural tendency, I suppose, and it is a way to kind of differentiate our war from all other American wars and even perhaps from other civil wars in other countries to make it a symbol of American tragedy. There is a counter-argument, however, and perhaps it started with Mark Neely's book in 2007 entitled The Civil War and the Limits of Destruction. Neely argued this tendency has gone too far. He refers to what he calls a cult of violence among historians. He also refers to arguments over the total number of men who died in the Civil War as approaching a fetish among some people. Maybe overstated, perhaps, I don't know, but provocative. And Neely marshals convincing evidence, in my view, to show that the Union Army, for example, burned and destroyed Georgia and the Shenandoah Valley at a much lower level than has been popularly thought. And to this argument, let's add another interesting article by Paul Paskoff, published in Civil War History in 2008, Measures of War, a Quantitative Examination of the Civil War's Destructiveness in the Confederacy. One of those nice articles that marshals all kinds of data. He shows that the Union Army tended, indeed, to create a high level of physical destructiveness in the Confederate States, but within a narrow zone that they operated in. And that, in other words, huge stretches of the Confederate countryside were never visited by Union armies and were relatively untouched. If you compare the total area of the 11 states that made up the CSA, he concludes that the Civil War had only a limited impact on destroying the infrastructure of the Confederacy. Only 5% of the county courthouses in the southern counties were destroyed by the war. Only 4% of the towns and cities were significantly destroyed. Southern railroads got hit harder because, of course, it's a railroad war to a large degree, but he still estimates that no more than about 30 to 40% of Southern railroads were destroyed by the Union Army, and he concedes that maybe it's as much as 47%. I would like to point out something he didn't point out. The Union Army, of course, did destroy a lot of railroads when they entered Confederate territory, but they needed to use them also. So they very often rebuilt those railroads for their own use with improved ties and improved rails. When the war was over, the federal government made a decision to give all those railroads back to their southern owners free of charge, with oftentimes far better rails and equipment than they had before the war was over. So you have to understand that countervailing argument in terms of the Union destruction of southern railroads. Paskoff sums it up. The historical record of the war is terrible enough to need neither embellishment nor exaggeration to impress anyone. It's a convincing argument, in my view. He writes with a relatively low intensity of the Civil War's physical destructiveness. He concludes that military action did not seriously damage the physical capital overall of Southern agriculture. Well, stats can tell us a good deal of important information, and they have been used by Hacker to emphasize the destructiveness of the Civil War, and they've been used by Paskoff to do the opposite, to de-emphasize it. But do statistics tell us the whole story? Is it possible that there was destruction that went unrecorded in the Civil War? And the answer certainly is yes. The hidden losses of the Civil War certainly do exist. Unseen destruction that's not easy to document. One area of this is how many civilians actually were killed or wounded by combat in the Civil War. We really don't know. James McPherson was absolutely right. There's no real evidence for it. I think of Jenny Wade. How many of you have heard of Jenny Wade of Gettysburg? Quite a few people. She's the most famous civilian in the whole Civil War to be killed as the direct result of combat. At Gettysburg, what's the story? She was baking biscuits in her home on the southern edge of Gettysburg, and an errant sharpshooter's bullet went through the wall and killed her. Do we make such a big deal of Jenny Wade's death? And I'm not minimizing it, because it was emblematic of a bigger problem, or because it was so unusual? I'm not sure that we can come up with the name of any other civilian in her category. Most Civil War battles took place in the countryside, and normally were preceded by movement of troops that gave families enough time to evacuate the area before the soldiers came to grips with each other. If you look at Civil War soldiers' letters and diaries, they often report coming across houses on the battlefield, but they rarely report finding anybody in them because the families had abandoned them by the time the shooting started. We pay so much attention to Jenny Wade because she was the only civilian killed as the direct result of combat at the largest battle of the Civil War, which, by the way, and quite a bit of it took place inside and around that populated town. Hidden losses of the Civil War are a fruitful area of historians of the conflict to explore. That's going to be a time-consuming and very difficult research project. There is little readily available data requiring a historian to look widely and deeply at many kinds of sources. And then let's think about another hidden cost of the Civil War. How many soldiers, North and South, were wounded in the Civil War but survived the war and yet died 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 years later as a result of their wounds? We don't know. Francis A. Walker, who was a soldier himself, the director of the 1870 census, estimated that 200,000 Union Army veterans died during the first 5 years after Appomattox due to wounds received or disease contracted during the Civil War. He based that only on an assumption that about 1 out of 3 Union soldiers who had been discharged with disability would perish of their war injuries within a few years after the conflict, and I emphasize his assumption. In short, even the director of the census had to guess about the long-range effects of battlefield injuries and disease-related health problems on those soldiers who did survive the Civil War, technically, but of course eventually succumbed to it. In my own research, I've come across several examples of this. And I've also come across an interesting example of how a battlefield injury affected the family of the soldier. It relates to a man named Captain O.A. Mack, M-A-C-K. He was a staff officer on the staff of General George H. Thomas in 1862. He was very badly wounded in the hip and the abdomen while conveying orders from Thomas to another officer during the heat of the Battle of Stones River on December 31st, 1862. Captain Mack's wife, Fanny, had been, as he put it, in feeble health for some years before the war, and the news of my dangerous wounds being announced abruptly in her presence produced so great a shock upon her nervous system that she never recovered from it. Mack spent several months recuperating in a Union hospital at Nashville, and on March 8, 1863, began to travel home to, I think, Cincinnati. Unfortunately, his wife Fanny died 2 days later while he was still en route. Her wounded husband did not reach home until March 14th, several days after her death. He never had a chance to see her one last time. Mack's wound was so bad that his surgeon thought he would die, but Mack credited Fanny's prayers for saving his life. "My wife has been exchanged for me," Mack told sympathetic friends. Well, when I just serendipitously came across the story of Captain Mack and Fanny, it struck me, it moved me. We probably will never know how many Fanny Macks there were out there, North and South. Civilians whose lives demonstrated that bullets and shells killed more than just the soldiers they hit. These are part of the hidden losses of the Civil War. They don't make a splash in the news media. They don't affect our consciousness much. We don't even have a high awareness of it. Known death tolls, and the bigger they are, apparently the more they impress. These do affect us. And when it comes to the Civil War death toll, we seem to take a degree of comfort in the bragging rights it gives us, allowing us a bigger badge of suffering as a nation, perhaps, if I could be allowed to put it that way. If that is right, then it begs a question. How does the United States stack up with other countries in terms of death tolls in wars? And my mind was immediately drawn to the Soviet Union in World War II. That is a subject of tremendous debate among the Russian people. A raging debate that has not ended. The Soviet government itself, from about 1945 up until the 1980s, officially put the death toll of its nation at 20 million Russian dead from 1941 to 45. By the 1980s, they upped it to 29 million. The Soviet government collapses in 1991. Communism is out. 2 years later, its primary successor, the government of the Russian Republic, issued a report in 1993 in which it was officially stated that no, not 29 million, only 8.6 million Russian dead. And keep in mind, we're talking about primarily civilian dead here. 3/4 or so of these numbers are civilian deaths rather than military deaths. Well, that announcement in 1993 sparked enormous controversy among private researchers, and there are a lot of them who have been using the internet to proclaim their conclusions. Their conclusions go from 38.5 million to 46 million Russian dead in World War II. Who knows what the reality is? Anytime you have a horrible catastrophe like World War II on the Eastern Front, the normal methods of keeping track of things just collapses, and it's anybody's guess. This is real argument. This is visceral argument. The debate continues, and this is a nice example of a Russian war memorial on the right, a kind of a modernist and very poignant and striking image of how a lot of Russians felt about what the Germans did to them in World War II. Let's turn our attention to comparative war deaths in other conflicts. Just to remind you, the American Civil War, anywhere from 620,000 to 750,000. What about a horrible internal conflict in China called the Taiping Rebellion of 1851 to 1864, estimated 20 to 100 million deaths. Obviously, the overwhelming majority civilian deaths. The horrible Russian Civil War between the Reds and the Whites that ensured the survival of the Bolshevik/communist government, 1918 to 21, estimated 5 to 9 million dead. The Chinese Civil War also pitied an internal communist movement versus an established government supported by the U.S. 1927 to 1949, 8 million dead. U.S. losses, World War I, 130 million dead. Soldiers, no civilians, about half of them due to disease rather than military action. U.S. losses in World War II, 300 million dead. And another maybe 300,000 dead, and another 800,000 wounded perhaps in World War II. In short, despite having a rich military history, this country, the United States, I think has not had a deep heritage of heavy loss in warfare compared to many, many other nations. If there are any bragging rights in an issue like this, then the Civil War is the only American conflict where we can lay claim to a very prominent degree of suffering in war. Let's shift our attention. I was curious, what about civilian death tolls in something other than war? Oh my gosh, the first thing we should think of is the famous Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1920. I want to remind you, pandemic is not an epidemic, it's a pandemic. Obviously that means it's something worse than normal. Starts in Spain, that's why it's called the Spanish flu. It's a global phenomenon. It is estimated that 500 million people all over the world were in one way or another affected by it. An estimated death toll of 50 to 100 million people globally. This is astonishing if those figures are accurate, and again, they are only estimates. The United States was hit by it. We believe that 500,000 to 765,000 people in the United States died of this pandemic. And by the way, most of those deaths occurred in only 9 months. Now, if you want to talk about what kind of effect does large-scale death have on a society, this would seem to be a more serious case than the Civil War to me. It's interesting that the total death toll is very similar to what we're saying happened in the Civil War. Obviously, American society has a lot more people in 1918 than in 1860. That's obvious too. But still, all of this death crunched together in a 9-month period, affecting so many families across the United States. And then an issue that's interesting to me, and I wanted to find out about it, and Carol's project was a nice way to do it. It's estimated that 3,551,332 Americans have died in automobile accidents from 1899 to 2012. And we don't have any monuments to them. And we sometimes don't even think that it's necessary to try to do something about it. But of course, society tends to pay far less attention to death caused by nature, by disease, or by bad drivers than it does to battle casualties, and I understand that. If we want to display a badge of war suffering, I think we need the Civil War, and we need higher estimates like hackers to increase the death toll. But I would say we don't need badges of war suffering. In fact, if you want to know my viewpoint, and it's not a strong viewpoint because I don't know stats, I'm not even convinced by hackers' analysis. I'm not saying that he's wrong, but I'm just saying that he hasn't convinced me on a personal level. It seems to me that his data is probably just as reliable or unreliable as the data used by previous commentators on the issue. I really just have, I love stats, and I love the way you can use numbers to illustrate points, but I also have a healthy disregard and fear of their overuse, and a fear of relying too heavily on them. And to give Hacker credit, he has the same fear. He says in his article, don't get too excited by this, because you know that you can't be 100% accurate on stuff like this. All we can do with an issue like this is to estimate the Civil War death toll with little hope of precision or finality, but I think we should also not be too tempted to think that the number of war dead has anything to do with national pride or international competition either. If you think that dying for one's country is an ennobling act, then that can happen when one soldier is killed as well as when 750,000 of them die. We should be interested in accurately ascertaining the level of destruction rather than getting excited if one study portrays it as higher than we always thought, and the evidence, in my view, tends to lessen our perceived wisdom on that score rather than increase it. So those are my views of it. I understand that we're going to have an impromptu question and answer session for you to ask questions of me and Dr. Toomey, and I'm very happy to do that. I'm looking forward